Hello everyone. So in this lecture we are going to talk about another important protocol of the application layer which is electronic mail or email. So email has been there since the beginning of the internet, and it was the most popular application when the internet has just evolved or when the internet came out. And it has become more and more powerful with more and more features over the years, and still it remains one of the most important and most utilized application of the application layer. So let's just start with this. In this lecture I'm going to talk about all the rest of the topics related to this chapter, which is email, DNS, peer-to-peer applications, and last one is the socket programming with UDP and TCP. Alright, so now let's talk about more for electronic email. Now this diagram actually presents an overview of the internet email system. From the diagram we can see that the three major components of the email are user agents, mail server, and the protocol, which is the simple SMTP protocol, simple mail transfer protocol. So the three main important components are user agents, mail server, and SMTP protocol, which we call it as the simple mail transfer protocol. What is a user agent? User agent is just like the mail reader. So it composes, it edits, it reads the mail messages, and the examples of the user agent, the applications, the email applications that we use, for example Outlook, Thunderbird, iPhone email client, etc. Outgoing and incoming messages, they are stored on the outgoing and incoming messages, they are stored on the mail server. Next is the mail server. Here we talked about user agents, now we talk about mail server. Now mail server consists of mailbox. Mailbox contains incoming messages for the user. Then there is a message queue. Message queue is for the outgoing mail messages, the messages that needs to be sent. So mail server consists of the mailbox. It consists of the incoming messages, and there is a message queue. Last component of the email is the SMTP protocol, simple mail transfer protocol. So SMTP protocol executes, or it exists between the mail server to send email messages. Now from the figure you can see that these are the user agents, which are the end devices or the host end systems. The devices, the smartphones or laptop or the personal computers that we use, they are the user agents. If you see, these are the servers. Now if you see the SMTP protocol, simple mail transfer protocol, it executes or it works between the servers to send, to receive and to send emails. So we have SMTP client and SMTP server. SMTP client, it sends sending the mail server, the one that sends the message to the mail server, and SMTP server is the server which receives the message. It's a receiving mail server. So client is a sending mail server and server is a receiving mail server. So for example, let me just give you a quick example. Let's consider this is user agent A and this is user agent B. Suppose user agent A wants to send email message to the user agent B. So what it will do, it will compose the message by using any of the application. Then that when the user clicks on the send button, that email will go to this mail server. Now this mail server is the SMTP client. This mail server will receive the message. Now this mail server will forward the message to the receiver's mail server, that means this mail server. So now this mail server is the SMTP client, this is sending the message, and since this server is receiving the message, this is a receiver mail server, or we call it as the SMTP server. Going ahead, now if you see over here in between the users, in between all the servers, the SMTP protocol operates. Alright, more on SMTP. SMTP uses TCP to reliably transfer email message from client to the server, and SMTP uses the port number 25. In the last class we learned about the difference between the TCP and UDP. So TCP, because it is connection oriented, so it reliably transfers the email message from the client to the server. It follows the direct transfer, that means sending server to the receiving server, so from client to the server. Now there are three phases of the transfer. First one is the handshaking, then transfer of message, and then closure. Because it follows the TCP, please recall the TCP, the working of the TCP, because TCP has three phases. In the first phase, it establishes the connection. In the second phase, the messages are transmitted, and in the third phase there is a termination. Because it follows the TCP, that's why there are three phases of the transfer. Then there is a command response interaction, like examples are HTTP, or by using the file transfer protocol if there is sending or receiving of the file. Now let's understand a scenario over here of sending the email message. So we have a user, although I have explained in the previous slide. Let's assume this is our user agent 1 and this is our user agent B, A and B. So this is Alice and this is Bob as per the example. Now when Alice wants to send an email message to the Bob, so how that email message will be sent and how the servers and the protocols will be used, let's just check it out. When the Alice composes and sends the message, so Alice uses user agent, any user agent, it can be Outlook, it can be Thunderbird, it can be anything, to compose a message to bob@someschool.edu. So this is the email address of the receiver. Now after this, Alice, the user agent of the Alice, sends the message to the mail server. This is the mail server of the Alice. So message is placed in the message queue in the mail server. Now since this will further forward the message, so this is a client side of SMTP. So here the client side of SMTP opens a TCP connection with the Bob's server. So this will be SMTP client, this will be SMTP server. So client side of SMTP opens a TCP connection with the Bob's mail server. Then SMTP client sends the message of the Alice over the TCP connection. So TCP connection will be opened between the two servers. Now Bob's email server places the message in the Bob's email box. So this mail server will place the message in the Bob's mailbox, whatever the mailbox. After that, Bob will invoke his user agent, whatever the user agent he is using to read that message. So this is all the steps, these are the steps how the email is sent from the sender to the receiver. Okay, let's just have a few and quick comparison of SMTP with the HTTP. SMTP uses persistent connections just like HTTP. In the last lecture we talked about persistent connections of HTTP, persistent and non-persistent. Persistent means all the objects, they are sent over same TCP connection. So different TCP connections are not opened for the sending different objects. So over one TCP connection everything is sent. Second thing is SMTP requires a message to be in a 7-bit ASCII format, which includes the header and the body. Header is your email address and body is your message. Second, other comparison is HTTP. This was the similarities. Other differences are HTTP is a pull protocol, SMTP is a push protocol. So this is the difference between them. Both have ASCII command and response interaction. So the command and response interaction is in the form of ASCII. This is a similarity between them, and this is also a similarity between them. In HTTP, each object is encapsulated in its own response message. That means response message for the single object. Whereas in SMTP, multi-objects, they are sent in the multi-part message. That means if multiple objects have to be sent, they are sent in the multi-part message. Now, what is a pull protocol and what is a push protocol? HTTP, we said that it's a pull protocol. That means someone loads information on a web server and users use HTTP to pull the information from the server at their convenience. SMTP is a push protocol. What is a push protocol? Push protocol means the sending mail server pushes the file to the receiver mail server. So the TCP connection is initiated by the machine that wants to send the file. Wants to send the file. So that was these were the differences and similarities between SMTP and HTTP. So this is the difference between HTTP and the SMTP. Alright, moving ahead, let's talk about the mail message format. You can see from here we have basically two parts, header and the body. And SMTP is a protocol which is required for exchanging the email messages, which we have learnt now. Alright, now there is the text messages format. First is the header line. Now what is there in the header line? It should have to, from and subject. Now from header line, to header line, and it has a subject. From means from the person, to means to the receiver, and subject whatever are the subject. As well as there are other optional header line, and we should note that these header lines are different from the SMTP commands. These are not similar to the SMTP commands. Then we have the body, which includes the message, and it is in the form of the ASCII characters only. So, for example, you might have, of course, you know how to write an email to, for example, abc@ucj.edu.sa and from xyz@ucj.edu.sa, and subject is any subject computer network slides, right? And then the body, you write over here your message, whatever the message you want to send. Alright, mail access protocols. Let's talk about mail access protocols over here. Alright, just now we learned that seeing this diagram, SMTP protocol operates between the server, right? So for example, the user agent of Alice places or pushes the email to the sender's mail server, and from this mail server it is sent to the receiver's mail server. Now the question is, how does the Bob or the receiver, because this is the mail is present over here in the server of the Bob's ISP. So how Bob can access this server to obtain the email? The answer is Bob can use access protocols to access his email from the receiver server. So between the servers, SMTP operates. Now between the receiver's mail server and the user agent, receiver user agent, we have the mail access protocol. There are currently a number of mail access protocols. Some of them are post office protocol, POP, post office protocol. Then we have IMAP, Internet Mail Access Protocol, and the last one is HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Let's just consider their example. POP uses the authorization and it uses the download. We will discuss more. IMAP has many features, but it is more complex also, because manipulation of the stored messages on the server can be done. And HTTP mail access protocols, they are which we use normally, like Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, etc. So we are going to discuss all these three protocols now. The first important protocol or the simplest protocol is the POP3 protocol, which is post office protocol. So it's a simple mail access protocol. It's quite short and readable, and because this protocol is quite simple, its functionality is rather limited also. So POP3 begins with the user agent. That means the client opens a TCP connection to the mail server on the port number 110. You need to remember these port numbers. Now, when the TCP connection is established, POP3 now progresses through three phases, which are authorization, transaction, and update. So first thing is TCP connection is established between the user agent and the mail server by using the port 110. So when the TCP connection is established, there are three phases: authorization, transaction, and update. Alright. Now what is authorization, what is transaction, and what is update? So authorization is the first phase, and during this phase the user sends the username and password for authentication. So the authorization phase is basically to authenticate the user. Second phase is the transaction phase. So the user agent retrieves the message during this phase. The user agent can mark the message for deletion, remove deletion marks, and obtain the mail statistics, whatever are the mail statistics. And the third phase is the update. Update occurs after the client has issued the quit command ending the POP3 session. At this time, the mail server will delete the messages that were marked for deletion. So these are the three phases that POP3 protocol follows between the user agent and the server. Although it looks similar like what we do by using the HTTP protocols, like your Gmail. You first of all log in into your account, then you do the transaction. Your mails are retrieved from the server. You read the email, you delete the emails, and but in this case the update occurs while we are logged in. In case of POP3, update occurs after the client quits the user agent. That means when POP3 session is terminated. So the mail server deletes the marked messages for deletion, but in our case, when we are using Gmail, they are deleted instantly. Alright, so moving ahead. Okay, so let's let's look at into the example. In transaction phase also, the user agent issues the commands and server responds with each command with a reply, like OK or the error commands. The authorization phase has two principal commands. These are the client commands: user, USCR, user, and the password, which is the password. So user and the password, and the server responses are OK or error. OK is if username and password are correct, that is OK, and if they are not correct, then it will be an error. And the transaction commands are like list, retrieve, and delete commands. So or quit commands. Let's just look into an example. The transaction will look something like this. For example, server. So it's OK, POP3 server is ready. Now user specifies the username Bob, server says OK, and the password, for the password it specifies Hungary, so OK. That means now user is successfully logged in. Alright, now it can use the, so authorization phase is over now. Now next is the transaction phase. So in the transaction phase, the client first of all issues the list command. List means list the number of messages. So there are two messages, 1498 and the another 912. Now client says there may be other messages also. Client says retrieve one. That means retrieve the message 1. So message contents are deleted. Then the client issues delete 1. It will not be deleted. The message 1 will not be deleted instantly. Then the client issues the command retrieve 2. Message 2 contents should be listed over here. Then the client issues the command delete 2. Message 2 will be deleted. But it will not be deleted. It is marked for deletion on the server. It is not deleted instantly. At the end, client issues the quit command. That means the client wants to quit out of the email server, and the server issues OK, and he is signed off. Okay, so let's just talk about these commands. The syntax for these commands is defined in the RFC, and after processing the quit command, POP3 server enters the update phase. So if you see, we have listed over here in the previous slide authorization and transaction. Now after a quit command is executed, POP3 server will enter the update phase and remove the message 1 and 2 from the server. So delete does not delete the message instantly, just like in our HTTP protocols. It is marked in the server for deletion. It will be deleted after the client quits from the user agent. Alright. Now there are two modes in which this POP3 protocol can operate. First one is the download and delete mode. Second one is the download and keep mode. So download and delete mode is that the recipient, let's consider the same names, Bob and Alice. Bob may be nomadic and he wants to access the email messages from multiple machines. So Bob's job location is not fixed and he wants to access his email from the multiple machines, for example in his office, at his home, or with his laptop. So the download and delete mode partitions the mail messages over these three machines in particular, and if Bob first reads a message on his office PC, he will not be able to read that message again from his laptop or the personal computer at home later in the evening. So Bob cannot reread the email if he changes the client. In the download and keep mode, the user agent leaves the messages on the mail server after downloading. So in this case, Bob can reread the messages from the different machine. He can access a message from a work and access it later again in the week from the home. So he can read the message from the different clients. POP3 is again a stateless protocol across the sessions, just like HTTP. Now let's talk about IMAP protocol, Internet Mail Access Protocol. Now Internet Mail Access Protocol keeps the messages all in one place at a server. Let's just consider the previous protocol POP3. Once Bob or once the person has downloaded the message to the local machine, he can create mail folders and he can move the downloaded messages into the folders. Bob can delete the messages, move the messages across the folders and search for the messages. But this scenario, that means the folders and the messages in the local machine, can pose a problem for a user, especially if the user is moving to different places, and this is not possible with POP3, because POP3 does not provide any means for creating remote folders and assigning messages to the folders. Folders have to be created in the local machine. To solve the problem like this IMAP protocol was defined. So it keeps all the messages in one place at a server. It allows the users to download and organize the message in the folders and search the message by some criteria. So it is associated with the recipient's inbox folder. So when the message first arrives at the server, it is associated with the recipient's inbox server. The receiver can then move the message to some new or the user created folder, read the message, delete the message, and so on. It also provides commands to allow the users to create folders, move messages from one folder to another, whereas POP3 does not provide this. IMAP also provides users to search remote folders for messages for matching the specific criteria. Now, unlike POP3, IMAP server maintains user state information across IMAP sessions, whereas POP3 is a stateless protocol. One more important feature of IMAP is that it has commands that permit a user agent to obtain the components of the message. For example, user agent can obtain just the message header or just a part of the multi-part or the main message. But the disadvantage of IMAP is it is more complex than POP3. Alright, so previous example, the one that we discussed about POP3, it uses download and delete mode. Bob cannot reread his email if he changes the client machine. That means Bob always has to read the message from the same computer at the same location. Download and keep copies messages on the different clients, but POP3 is a stateless across the session. IMAP keeps all the message in one place in the server. It allows the user to organize message in the folder. It keeps the user state across the session, and which allows names of folders and mappings between message ID and folder name. So this is a comparison between POP3 and IMAP. Alright, now let's move on to the web-based email or the HTTP email. That is nothing but the web-based email. The email is a web-based and the user agent is the web browser application. We all are familiar with this. We all are using it. Sending and receiving emails are done through the web browser using HTTP protocol. User agent is a web browser and user communicates with its remote mailbox via HTTP. The next protocol that we are going to talk about is the DNS, which is the domain name service, one of the very important protocol of the application layer. Okay. Alright. Now we are human beings. We can be identified by many ways. We have many identifications. For example, we can be identified by our name that appear on our birth certificate. We can be identified by our social security number. We can be identified by our passport number. We can be identified by our driving license numbers. Although each of these identifiers can be used to identify people within a given context, one identifier may be more appropriate than another. It can be more appropriate than another. So, just like human beings can be identified in many ways, similarly, the internet hosts or the routers can be identified. One identification for the host is the host name, which we use yahoo.com, gmail.com. It is used by the humans because we can memorize these English names. We cannot memorize the numbers. So these are the mnemonic, and these can be remembered by the humans. However, host names provide little or very less information about the location of the host. Where this host exists, the host name does not tell about. For example, if I have a host name www.gmail.com, I don't know where it is located. But if I have a host name, for example, gmail.sa, I know that probably the server will most be located in the Saudi Arabia. Also, host name consists of variable length of alphanumeric characters, and it would be very difficult to be learned by the routers or processed by the routers. So that's why hosts are also identified by their 32-bit address which is called as the IP address. IP address is used to identify hosts on the internet, and it is used by humans to identify the host. Now, how to map between IP addresses and the name and vice versa, we will learn about it. Alright, so DNS, domain name system. Domain name system is a distributed database. It's implemented in hierarchy of many domain name system servers. So we just now learned that there are two ways to identify the host, by host name and by IP address. We, being the human, prefer a more mnemonic way. Now, in order to reconcile these preferences, we need a directory service that can translate the host name to the IP addresses. This is the main task of the internet domain name system. So, to translate the host name to the IP addresses, this is the main task of the internet's domain name system. So, what is a DNS? DNS is a distributed database, and it is implemented in the hierarchy of the DNS servers. Second thing is, DNS is an application layer protocol. Now, when a question is asked in the exam, what is DNS? Based on the number of marks, you should answer all the points, right? So, it makes the complete definition. First thing is, DNS is a distributed database which is implemented in the hierarchy of the DNS servers. Second thing is, DNS is an application layer protocol that allows the host to query the distributed database. So this makes the complete definition of the DNS. So it's an application layer protocol where hosts and DNS servers can communicate for translation or mapping of what? Mapping of IP address and the host name. Now the DNS protocol runs over UDP protocol of transport layer. So we learned previously that a transport layer has two protocols, TCP and UDP. Email uses TCP. You must know which transport layer protocol is used by which application of the application layer. Email uses TCP. DNS uses UDP, UDP protocol of the transport layer, and the port number used by DNS is the 53. Protocol of transport layer and port number for each application to memorize is very important. DNS protocol is implemented as an application layer protocol at the network's edge. So it is employed by other application layer protocol including HTTP, SMTP and FTP to translate user supplied host name to the IP address. Let's consider an example. Let's consider an example of what happens. Let's consider an example. What happens when your browser request for the URL, for example www.ucj.edu.sa or sunschool.edu.index.html. So in order for the user's host to be able to send an HTTP request message to www.sunschool.edu, user's host must first of all find out the IP address of www.sunschool.edu. So first of all, IP address of that server needs to be find out. So let's understand DNS services. First service is host name to IP address translation, which is called as mapping, which I am just talking about. That if for example your browser wants to request for www.ucj.edu.sa/admissions, then in that case, when your browser sends a message to the server of UCJ, your host must first of all find out the IP address of the UCJ server. So how it happens? The user machine runs the client side of the DNS application. Now the browser extracts the host name www.ucj.edu.sa from the URL and it passes the host name to the client side of the DNS application. Now the DNS client, so the client will send a query message which consists of the host name to the DNS server. Now DNS client receives a reply from the server which includes the IP address for that host name. Once the browser receives the IP address from the DNS server, it can initiate a TCP connection to the HTTP server process located at the port number 80. So whenever you are using any HTTP protocol, your HTTP uses the DNS service for translating the host name to the IP address, because routers cannot recognize the host names with their English names. They can only recognize the hosts or the machines with their IP addresses. So HTTP uses the DNS service. So from this example, we know that DNS adds additional delay when we are using the HTTP to the internet applications. But we will know that the desired IP address is often cached in the DNS server, just like we used the concept of the proxy server of the web or the web cache. So it is also stored in the DNS server. Now other important services are host aliasing. Now what is host aliasing? A host with a complicated host name can have one or more aliases. Aliases are the other names. For example, you have your name in college. You may have your nickname. So they are called as aliases. A host with a complicated host name can have one or more alias names. For example, the host with a name such as relay-l-west-host.enterprise.com. It can have two other names, two aliases like enterprise.com, www.enterprise.com. So in this case, host name, which is the original host name, it's a canonical host name. So this host name is a canonical host name, and these two other names are the aliases. Alias host names are more mnemonic. If you see over here, these host names are more mnemonic, more understood, and than the canonical host names. DNS can be invoked by an application to invoke the canonical host name for a supplied alias host name. So canonical host name can be invoked by supplying the alias of that host name. Third DNS service is the mail server aliasing. Alias host names such as hotmail.com. We just write hotmail.com or gmail.com. So it provides the mail server aliasing also. It is required that the email service, email addresses should be mnemonic, because let's consider an example. For example, a person XYZ has an account with the Hotmail or the Gmail, and the email address is like abc@hotmail.com. However, but the host name of the Hotmail server is quite complicated, just like we had in the previous example, relay1.westcoast.hotmail.com. The Hotmail server is more complicated and less mnemonic. So DNS can be invoked by mail application to obtain the canonical host name for a supplied alias host name as well as the IP address of the host. Next is the load distribution. DNS is also used to perform the load distribution among the replicated servers. Replicated servers means duplicate servers. Many IP addresses, they correspond to the one name, to the one DNS name, such as replicated web servers. Busy sites, when we have servers which are quite busy, like CNN.com, they have replicated multiple servers, and with each server running on a different end system and having a different IP address. For example, Google.com may have many different replicated servers, and each server will have a different IP addresses. For a replicated web server, a set of IP address is associated with one canonical hostname. The DNS database contains the set of IP addresses, and when any of the client makes a DNS query for a name mapped to the set of addresses, server responds with the full list of IP addresses, but rotates the ordering of the addresses with each reply. So it rotates the ordering of the addresses. HTTP request message and SMTP request message, they always send to the first IP address in the list. So these were the services which are provided by the DNS. Now let's look at it. How does the DNS work? We do not have why not to centralize a DNS? A simple design for DNS would have one DNS server. It should have, ideally, it should have one DNS server that contains all the mappings, and in the centralized design, client will simply contact to the centralized DNS server, and the DNS server will respond directly. Looks like simple, but it has many disadvantages, or we can say a problem. Single point of failure. If we have centralized system, then in that case, if the central DNS server crashes, so the whole internet will die. Traffic volume. A single DNS server will have to handle millions or billions of DNS queries and for all the HTTP and email requests. Now imagine how much traffic volume will be generated at the centralized DNS server. Next is distant centralized database. A single DNS server cannot be close to all the querying clients. So if we put a single DNS server, for example, in the New York City, then all the queries from Australia must travel to the other side of the globe. Perhaps it will take a longer time for loading the pages. Last one is the maintenance. A single DNS server would have to keep records for all the internet hosts. Also, centralized database will be quite huge, and it would have to be updated frequently to account for every new host. So a centralized database in a single DNS server simply does not scale, and the DNS is actually distributed by design. It is not centralized, rather it is distributed by design. So we will understand the hierarchical structure. So it has a hierarchical structure. We say that it has a distributed database and it is distributed by design. It follows the hierarchical structure. So there are three classes of the DNS server. At the top we have root domain name server, then we have TLD server, top level domain servers, then we have authoritative DNS servers. Alright, so this is the distributed, or we call it as the hierarchical design of the DNS. At the top we have one root DNS server, then there are TLD, these are the top level domain servers, and then we have authoritative DNS server. So for example, if now at the TLD servers we have com, we have org, we have edu, we have many more. So if a client wants IP for Amazon.com, client's query will go to the root server. So the query will go to the root server to find the com server, to find com DNS server. So a response with com IP address will be generated. Now the client will query the com DNS server to get the Amazon com DNS server a response with amazon.com IP address will be generated. Now client queries amazon.com DNS server to get the IP address for the amazon.com. A response with the www.amazon.com IP address is returned. So for example, we again consider, for example, if we want to have ucj.edu.sa. So for us, the top level server is the SA server. So if we are searching for ucj.edu.sa, so our query will go to the root server. Root server is our SA server, the server over here. Then we will find our client will query the SA server to find the IP address of the EDU server, because it's a EDU. Now our next query will go to the EDU server to get the ucj.edu IP address. Then the query will go to the ucj.edu server to get the IP address of the www.ucj.edu.sa, and in the response message we will get the IP address. Alright, so root servers. It is contacted by local name server that cannot resolve name. Root name server, there are 13 root DNS server. Root DNS server, they contact the TLD name server to it gets the mapping and it returns the mapping to the local name servers. So root name servers, there are 13 root name servers. Most of them they are located in North America. You can check the list of current root name servers also. Each of the 13 root name servers is like as if it were a single server. Each server is actually a cluster of replicated server for both security and reliability purposes. So it's a cluster of replicated servers. Then the top level domain servers. These servers are responsible for top level domains such as com, org, net, edu, gov for all country top level domains such as SA, UK, FR, CA and Japan, JP. The company network solutions maintains the TLD server for the COM top level domain, and the company EduCause maintains the TLD servers for the Edu top level domain. Last one is the authoritative DNS servers. Every organization with publicly accessible hosts on the internet must provide publicly accessible DNS record that should map the name of those hosts to the IP addresses. So authoritative DNS server of the organization houses these DNA records, and organization can choose to implement its own authoritative DNS server to hold these records, or it can pay to have these records to be stored in the some authoritative DNS server of some service providers. Most of the universities and the large companies, they implement and maintain their own primary and secondary authoritative DNS servers. So this is all about the servers. Okay, then we have the local DNS name server. It does not strictly belong to the hierarchy. Each ISP, internet service provider, residential company or university, they have the one, and which is also called as the default name server, which we have in our college too. We will learn more about it when we learn this Wireshark. When the host makes DNS query, the query is sent first to the local DNS server. So it is not sent directly to the root level server, rather it is sent to the local DNS server. And local DNS server has a local cache of recent mapping of name to address mapping, but many times it may be out of date. Local DNS server acts as a proxy. It forwards the query into the hierarchy. So every organization, they have the local DNS server. Alright, The next application we are going to talk is peer-to-peer applications. So we learned about peer-to-peer applications in the beginning of the chapter. Okay, so peer-to-peer architecture does not follow any client server. There is no server, there is no always on server, and the end systems or the host, they communicate directly with each other. Peers are intermittently connected and they can change their IP addresses. For example, in this picture you can see that a car is connected with a laptop. After a few times a car can travel to other direction and this laptop can also travel to another direction. So they may be connected wirelessly. Examples of peer-to-peer, pure peer-to-peer architecture are file distribution, which is BitTorrent, streaming application like Netflix, VoIP applications like Skype. In this figure we are comparing, we are doing a comparison between client server and peer-to-peer applications. How much time to distribute file of size f, any size of f some fixed size, from one server to n peers. So if you see, if the client server architecture is used, now this is the minimum distribution time. So time to distribute a file of size, let's say 1 gigabyte from one server to n peers, right? So n peers, let's say n can be any number, 50 peers maybe. If we are using 50 clients, then if you see n peers, the time taken in the client server environment is approximately 3.5 hours. Whereas in peer-to-peer architecture, if you see, it's approximately touching 1 hour 60 minutes. So it's quite lesser as compared to the client server. So if you see file distribution time, for the client server architecture is quite more than the peer-to-peer architecture. The minimal distribution time is not always less for peer-to-peer. That it's not always, but it is also less than, it is less than. So applications with the peer-to-peer architecture, they are self-scaling actually. Alright, so in this case we are going to talk about peer-to-peer file distribution protocol, which is the BitTorrent protocol. Okay, so alright, so let's just talk about it. What is BitTorrent protocol? BitTorrent is a popular point-to-point protocol for distribution of the files. You might have used the torrent application. In BitTorrent, the collection of all peers which are participating in the distribution of a particular file, they are called as the torrent. So if you see, these all computers which are joined together, they are all peers. These computers which are joined together, they are all peers. So they are the group of peers exchanging chunk of files. Peers in the torrent, they download equal size chunks of file from one another. So peers, they download equal size chunks from one another. And a typical chunk size can be of 256 KB. So file is divided into a 256 kilobyte chunks. Peers in the torrent send and receive the file chunks. So when a peer first joins a torrent, it has no chunks. So when a peer first of all joins this torrent group, it has no chunks. Over a time, it accumulates more and more chunks, because when the chunks are like exchanged with each other, it accumulates more and more chunks. While it downloads chunks, it also uploads the chunks for other peers also. So if it is downloading, it is uploading also. So Alice arrives first of all, it obtains list of peers from the tracker. Tracker is, it tracks peers participate in the chunk which are in the server, and it begins exchanging file chunks with peers in the torrent. So when peer first arrives, it has no chunks. Over the time, it accumulates the chunks, and while it downloads the chunks, it also uploads the chunks to other peers. Once a peer has acquired entire file, so for example, it has acquired entire file, it may leave the torrent or it may remain in the torrent. So I am selfish, I can leave the torrent, but I am generous, I will remain in the torrent so as to continue upload the chunks to other peers. Also, any peer may leave the torrent anytime with only a subset of chunks, and later it may join the torrent to obtain more chunks. So peer joining the torrent, it has no chunks, but over the time it will accumulate from other peers. It registers with the tracker to get list of peers, connects to the subset of the peers which are called as neighbors. Now let's look just a closer look. Since BitTorrent is quite a complicated protocol, we will describe only few mechanisms. Each torrent has an infrastructure node which is called as the tracker. So when peer joins the torrent, it registers itself with the tracker and periodically informs the tracker that it is still in the torrent. So this way the tracker keeps track of the peers that are participating in the torrent. So tracker keeps a list of the peers or tracks the peers which are in the torrent. A given torrent may have fewer than 10 or more than 10,000 peers participating at any instant of time. So for example, new peer over here, Alice joins the torrent, tracker randomly selects subset of the peers, let's assume 10 or 15 from the set of party. If there are 100, it may choose only 10 or 15 or 50 peers randomly and sends the IP addresses of these 10 or 15 peers to the Alice. When the Alice has this list of peers, now Alice will try to establish the connection, TCP connection with all the peers in this list. So let's say we call all the peers with which Alice has succeeded in establishing this TCP connection, we call it as the neighboring peers. So it registers with the tracker to get a list of peers, connects to the subset of the peers. So if you see, it has first neighbor, second neighbor, so it is connected. Normally Alice, the person will have many more as the time evolves. Now as the time evolves, some of these peers may leave the torrent, some of them and other peers may attempt to establish TCP connection with the Alice. So peers, neighboring peers will fluctuate over the time, right? So at any given time, each peer will have subset of chunks from the file with different peers having different subsets, and periodically Alice will ask each peer, each of her neighboring peer for the list of the chunks they have. If for example Alice has 10 or 15 neighbors, she will have 10 or 15 list of chunks. With this knowledge, Alice will issue requests for the chunks she currently does not have. So while downloading, peer uploads the chunks, peers may change peers with whom it exchanges the chunks, peer may come and go. Once peer has entire file, it may leave or it may remain in the torrent. Alright. Okay, so at any given time, different peers have different subset of chunks. Periodically, Alice may ask each peer for a list of chunks they have, and Alice can request for missing chunks from the peers rarest first. So at a given time, Alice will have a subset of chunks and will know which chunks her neighbor have. And with this information, Alice will have two important decisions to make. First, which chunks she should request from her neighbors, and second, to which of her neighbors should she send requested chunks, because she has 10 neighbors. So she should send the requested chunks to the first neighbor, to the second neighbor, to the third neighbor, or so on. So in deciding in which chunks to request, Alice will use the technique which is called as the rarest first. The idea here is to determine from amongst the chunks she doesn't have the chunks which are least present in the group, which are rarest among the neighbors, and then request those rarest chunks, and in this manner the rarest chunks get more quickly redistributed, aiming to equalize the number of copies of each chunk in the torrent. Now, to determine which request she responds, BitTorrent has a clever trading algorithm, and the idea is Alice gives priority to the neighbors that are currently supplying the data to her highest rates. So Alice sends chunks to those 4 peers currently sending her the chunks at the highest rate. So specifically for each of her neighbors, Alice will measure the rate at which she is receiving the bits and determine the 4 peers that are feeding her the bits at the highest rate. She will then reciprocate by sending the chunks to the same 4 peer. Other peers are choked by Alice. That means they do not receive the chunks from her, and re-evaluation of the top 4 peers is done every 10 seconds. Now these 4 peers are said to be unchoked and the others are said to be choked peers. Every 30 seconds randomly it selects another peer, starts sending the chunks. So every 30 seconds she also picks one additional neighbor and sends its chunks, and she calls the randomly chosen peer Bob. In the BitTorrent, Bob is said to be optimistically choked. This peer, so newly chosen peer may join the top 4. So because Alice is sending data to Bob, she may become one of the Bob's top 4 uploaders, in which in this case Bob may also start sending the data to the Alice. So if the rate at which Bob sends the data to the Alice is quite high, then the Bob will in turn become one of the Alice top 4 uploaders. So every 30 seconds they are like updating their neighbors. So Alice optimistically unchokes Bob. Alice becomes one of the Bob's top 4 providers. Bob also reciprocates and Bob becomes one of the Alice top 4 providers. So higher upload rate, find better trading partners and get the file faster. So if the 2 peers, they are satisfied with the trading, they will put each other in their top 4 list and continue exchanging with the chunks until they find a better partner. So the effect is that peers are capable of uploading at a good rate, and the random neighbor selection also allows new peers to get new chunks. All other neighboring peers, besides these top 4 or 5, they are choked. That means they do not receive any chunks from Alice. So BitTorrent has a number of interesting mechanisms which we are not going to discuss over here. So this is how the BitTorrent protocol works. That means you give something, you take something. So you are actually trading, you are giving the chunks of data, you are getting the chunks of data. So that is all about the application layer protocols discussed in this chapter, and for any questions kindly ask it in the live class or in the class, and thank you so much.